Story 1. I awoke to the sound of a baby crying, a soft, pitiful wail that sliced through the stillness of the night. It was the kind of cry that no parent could ignore, but it didn't make sense. I don't have children. I live alone. The sound seemed to come from somewhere inside the house, but I couldn't tell where. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't a dream. I was wide awake. The crying grew louder, more desperate. My chest tightened as the eerie reality settled in. I had no explanation. The house was silent moments ago, locked and secure, just as it always was. I had lived here alone for years, and none of my neighbors had babies, not ones this young. Yet, this wailing was real. Throwing off the covers, I moved cautiously toward the bedroom door. Darkness enveloped the house, thick and suffocating. The sound drew me downstairs, each creak of the wooden steps an uneasy reminder of my isolation. As I reached the hallway, the crying seemed closer now, echoing through the walls. My breath came shallow, my heart pounding with each step toward the living room. But when I flicked on the light, the room was empty. No crib, no baby, no trace of anything unusual. The crying persisted. It was louder, more urgent, and coming from the kitchen. Frozen in place, I debated whether to follow. My mind screamed for logic, but nothing about this felt logical. The kitchen, like the living room, was empty. The cries grew sharper, piercing the silence. They were behind me. Spinning around, I saw nothing but shadows pooling at the edges of the room. Suddenly, the cries shifted again, fainter now, but unmistakably coming from below. The basement. My stomach twisted as I faced the basement door. I hadn't been down there in weeks, and yet the cries felt like a summons. Hand trembling, I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The hinges groaned as the door swung open, revealing the narrow staircase descending into the darkness. I flicked on the light, but it did little to banish the gloom. A musty chill crept up from below, and with every step down, the cries intensified, echoing off the bare cement walls. The basement was as it always had been, cramped and cluttered, filled with forgotten boxes and old furniture. I scanned the room, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no baby. There was nothing at all. And yet, the cries seemed to vibrate through the very walls, surrounding me. My eyes darted to a spot on the floor, a crumpled piece of paper lying near the far corner. Against my better judgment, I moved toward it, my hands shaking as I bent down and picked it up. It was a photograph, old and faded. The image showed a woman holding a baby, but something about it was deeply wrong. The woman's face was smudged, as though deliberately blurred, and the baby's wide eyes seemed almost too aware. Too knowing. The longer I stared at it, the more it felt as though the baby was staring back. The cries stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the crying had been, oppressive and suffocating. My breath hitched as I backed away, still clutching the photo. The basement felt alive, as though it were watching me. I spun on my heel and raced up the stairs, not daring to look back. As soon as I slammed the basement door shut, the crying resumed, louder than ever. But this time, the sound was frantic, filled with pain. I locked the door, my hand trembling, and stumbled into the living room. The cries persisted, muffled behind the door but growing in intensity. I sank onto the couch, trying to make sense of what had happened. Morning eventually came, bringing an unsettling quiet with it. When I returned to the basement, there was nothing out of place. No photo. No sign of anything unusual. But deep down, I knew the cries hadn't been a dream or a figment of my imagination. Something had happened in this house, something I couldn't explain. And even now, I can still hear it. Somewhere in the shadows of my home, the baby is still crying. Story 2. It was one of those nights when the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The moonlight slipped through the curtains, casting faint, ghostly shadows across the room. I was on the couch, trying to unwind after a long day, when something caught my attention, a dark figure, standing motionless just beyond the window. Its outline was faint, almost blending with the night, but it was there. My body tensed, my heart pounding as if it were trying to warn me. For a moment, I doubted myself. Had I imagined it? The quiet comfort of the night suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. I forced myself to stand, my breath shallow and unsteady. My feet dragged across the floor, every step weighed down by the inexplicable dread twisting in my chest. As I reached the blinds, a cold shiver ran down my spine, and I hesitated. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. Summoning my courage, I yanked the blinds open. The yard outside was empty, bathed in the soft, indifferent glow of the streetlight. No shadow, no figure, just an expanse of quiet nothingness. My breath caught, a tight knot forming in my chest. It was nothing, I told myself. Maybe a branch swayed in the wind, or maybe it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. The stillness outside felt unnatural, like the calm before something terrible. I sank back onto the couch, my mind racing to rationalize what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. The house was unnervingly quiet, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the oppressive stillness. I tried to focus on the television, but the memory of that dark figure wouldn't leave me. It had been solid, undeniable, and yet, gone. The sense of being watched lingered, prickling the back of my neck. I glanced at the window again, half expecting to see the figure there, its shadow looming. The blinds were still open, the yard seemingly empty. Yet the air in the room felt thick, as though something unseen lingered just beyond my sight. The thought clawed at me, growing harder to ignore with every passing second. Unable to sit still, I stood and began pacing the room. My eyes darted to the window over and over, each glance a desperate search for reassurance, or confirmation of my fear. The night felt alive, not with peace, but with a suffocating stillness, as if something waited, watching for me to falter. The thought struck me, is the door locked? I moved toward it, each step a battle against the dread curling in my stomach. As I approached, I glanced out the small window beside the door. The yard was as empty as before, the only movement coming from the wind stirring the leaves. I let out a shaky breath, ready to turn away, until a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. My heart stopped. For a fleeting moment, I saw it again, the figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching. I spun back toward the window, my pulse hammering in my ears, but there was nothing. The yard was empty once more, the shadows undisturbed. My chest tightened as my mind raced through 100 possibilities, none of them comforting. Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was someone, or something, truly out there? I stumbled into the kitchen, desperate to calm myself. My hands trembled as I poured a glass of water. The sensation of being watched was unbearable now, as if unseen eyes followed my every move. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but the room behind me was empty. Too empty. Too quiet. I returned to the living room, the television's glow doing little to banish the oppressive darkness. Every sound, the groan of the floorboards, the faint hum of the fridge, felt like a warning, a reminder that I was not alone. My eyes kept drifting back to the window, expecting, no, dreading, that familiar silhouette. But it never appeared. The hours crept by, the weight of the night pressing down on me. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me to bed, the unease clung to me like a second skin. I lay awake, listening to the stillness, every creak of the house like a whispered threat. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were restless, haunted by shadows and the unshakable feeling of being watched. Morning came, bringing light and a fragile sense of normalcy. The yard outside was peaceful again, the night's shadows banished. But the feeling of unease lingered, a shadow of its own, refusing to fade. I couldn't shake the certainty that I hadn't been alone last night. Something, or someone, had been watching me. And though the day promised safety, I knew the night would come again. And so might it. Story 3. The attic was suffused with an air of forgotten time, the dust hanging in stillness as I sorted through decades of abandoned belongings. Among the cobwebbed boxes, my hands fell upon a stack of aged letters. Their edges were worn, their yellowed paper soft as if handled countless times. I assumed they might be old family correspondence or forgotten notes from friends, but when I picked one up, my heart skipped. Each letter was addressed to me. My full name was written in delicate, precise cursive on every envelope. At first, I thought it was some strange coincidence, maybe a misfiled batch of papers. But curiosity won, and I carefully opened the first envelope. The paper inside crackled faintly, and the scent of age wafted out. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, uncannily similar to my grandmother's. But when my eyes fell on the date, I froze. The letter was dated years before I was born. I read the words slowly, trying to make sense of them. The message inside was heartfelt but cryptic, describing events and places I didn't recognize, yet written as if the writer knew me intimately. It felt wrong, unsettling. My hands trembled as I set the first letter aside and reached for another. The next one was no less bizarre. Dated several years later, it too contained details about people I didn't know and a life I hadn't lived. But the words felt personal, like they were pulled from the deepest corners of my soul. The writer's voice carried an eerie familiarity. The air in the attic seemed to grow colder as I sifted through the stack. My pulse quickened as I realized a terrifying truth: each letter described events from my life, moments I had not yet experienced. They spoke of places I had never been, people I had yet to meet, even thoughts I didn't yet know I would have. These weren't just letters. They were my future. Panic clawed at me as I devoured each unsettling detail. One described my first job. Another, a move to a new city. Another captured the first time I'd fall in love, recounting the moment so vividly it felt as if I were living it already. The more I read, the more the lines between past, present, and future blurred. My breath hitched as I came across one letter, dated only a few years from now. It was unlike the others. The tone was urgent, filled with warnings. It spoke of a pivotal decision I'd soon have to make, one that would alter the course of my life. The words urged me to trust my instincts, to choose carefully. But how could these letters exist? Who had written them? Was it possible that I had written them, somehow, though I had no memory of doing so? Or was someone else orchestrating this, a figure lurking in the shadows of time? The weight of the letters pressed down on me as I stood in the dim attic. My legs felt weak. The silence around me thickened, oppressive, as if the room itself held its breath. I glanced around nervously, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching me. The last letter I read left me shaken. It painted a picture of inevitability, as if my life had already been lived, my choices already made. A sense of dread seeped into my chest. If the letters were true, did I even have the power to change what was coming? Or was I merely following a path that had already been written? I placed the letters back in the box, my hands trembling as I sealed it shut. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done with me. That they were waiting. Waiting for something I didn't yet understand. As I climbed down the attic stairs, the box tucked under my arm, a chill ran down my spine. The knowledge of what I'd uncovered weighed heavily on me. Was my future truly mine to shape, or was I helplessly bound to the destiny these letters foretold? Even now, I can't escape the feeling that the letters have changed something in me, awakened something. And as much as I want to bury them, I know they'll call to me again. And next time, I may not be able to resist. Story 4. It started so innocently that I barely gave it a second thought. One morning, as I reached into the pocket of my jacket, my fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, expecting an old receipt or some forgotten scrap, but as I unfolded it, the words written on it sent a slight chill down my spine: "Be careful tonight." I stared at the note for a moment before shrugging it off. Maybe it was something I had scribbled down and forgotten about. It wasn't unusual to find random papers in my jacket pockets, after all. I crumpled it and tossed it aside without another thought. Later that same day, I reached into the same pocket and found another note. This one felt different. The handwriting was bold, almost frantic, and the word struck me like a slap: "They're watching." My stomach churned. How could anyone know? I hadn't told anyone about my plans that evening, and yet here it was, a message meant for me. My hands trembled as I shoved the note back into my pocket, trying to ignore the cold unease creeping up my spine. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I checked my jacket again. Another note waited there, folded neatly, as if mocking me. This time, it simply read, "It's too late." I stood frozen in my doorway, heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation. I had lived alone for years. No one knew my daily routine, and I didn't have enemies, or at least, none I knew of. The note crumpled in my shaking hand as I scanned the empty street outside my house. That evening, I sat on my couch, clutching the notes. A prank. That had to be it. Someone was messing with me, playing a twisted joke. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. No one had access to my jacket. No one had been near me, and I hadn't shared my plans with anyone. The next day brought another note. This one made my blood run cold: "Look behind you." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to find someone standing there, but the room was empty. The house was still. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone had been standing behind me, just out of reach. Days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. The notes kept coming. Each day, a new message appeared in my jacket pocket, growing more cryptic and threatening. Don't trust anyone. It's not safe. You're being followed. I started watching my surroundings, my paranoia growing with each passing day. But there was no sign of anyone following me, no strange cars parked on my street, no unfamiliar faces in the neighborhood. Yet, the notes persisted, as if taunting me. One evening, determined to put an end to the madness, I took my jacket off and laid it on the table. I checked the pockets, turning them inside out. They were empty. Satisfied, I turned to leave the room. That's when I heard it. The faint whisper of paper sliding against fabric. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. A single piece of paper now peeked out of my jacket pocket. My hands shook as I unfolded it, the words leaping off the page: "You're not alone." The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, as though someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my heart race. I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. The next morning, another note appeared: "It's happening tonight." The finality of those words made my stomach drop. My hands trembled as I crumpled the note and shoved it into my pocket. I couldn't stay in my house, but I didn't know where to go. I felt trapped, the walls of my once safe home closing in on me. As evening fell, I left the house, glancing over my shoulder with every step. For the first time, I felt certain I wasn't alone. Someone was there, just beyond my sight, following me. The fear was suffocating, and I knew, whatever was coming, it wasn't over. I don't know what they want. I don't know who they are. All I know is that I can't escape, and the notes were never a warning. They were a promise. Story 5. I was still half asleep when my phone rang, the bright screen piercing the dim morning light. Groaning, I reached over, expecting to see a familiar name flash on the caller ID. But when I glanced at the screen, my heart stuttered. The caller ID displayed something impossible: my own number. Confused and unsettled, I hesitated before answering. "Hello." My voice cracked, thick with grogginess. A voice responded, calm but unfamiliar, though there was something eerily recognizable about it. "Hey, this is your boss. You missed your shift today. What happened? We were expecting you." I bolted upright in bed, my stomach tightening. "I don't have a shift today," I stammered, trying to make sense of the situation. I knew for a fact I wasn't scheduled. The line was quiet for a beat before the voice returned, sharper now. "Well, you're on the schedule. Next time, call if you're not showing up. This is unprofessional." Panic clawed at me. I hadn't overlooked anything, I had checked the schedule yesterday. I was certain I had the day off. "I swear, I wasn't scheduled," I tried to explain, but the words felt thin, useless. The voice on the other end cut me off. "We'll talk about this when you come in." And just like that, the call ended. I stared at my phone, disbelief twisting into dread. The call had come from my own number, and yet, how could it? My fingers fumbled as I checked the call log, confirming what I'd already seen. It wasn't a dream. My heart thudded in my chest as the conversation replayed in my mind. The voice, it wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Could it have been a glitch? A prank? None of it made sense. Desperate for clarity, I pulled up my work schedule. It was exactly as I remembered, no shifts for the day. The unease settled deeper in my chest. What was happening? I decided to call my boss, hoping to straighten things out, but the call didn't connect. It didn't even ring. Just silence, as if the number no longer existed. I tried again. Nothing. My mind spun as a cold chill ran down my spine. Was any of this real? I paced the room, trying to convince myself it was all some bizarre misunderstanding. But then, my phone buzzed. A text. I froze, staring at the notification. It was from my boss, "Come in immediately. We need to talk." My hands trembled as I read the words. There was an urgency in the message that felt off. Not like my boss at all. My throat tightened, the walls of my apartment suddenly feeling closer than they should. Against my better judgment, I decided to go in. The hours before the meeting crawled by, heavy with a suffocating dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Even in the safety of daylight, the air in my apartment felt thick, wrong. When the time finally came, I left the house, though every instinct screamed for me to stay. When I arrived, my boss greeted me with an annoyed expression. "You're late," they said curtly, their tone clipped. I opened my mouth, but the words tangled in my throat. What about the call? And the message?" I finally managed. My boss's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about? There was no call. No message. You're always on the schedule. This meeting was planned." Their gaze pierced through me, and I couldn't tell if it was frustration or something darker. The ground felt like it had been pulled from under me. "But I wasn't scheduled," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I checked. I'm sure of it." They shook their head, dismissing me. "Get it together," they muttered before turning away. I left the meeting in a daze, my thoughts spiraling. My phone had called itself. My boss had insisted I was scheduled for a shift I knew didn't exist. And now, standing here, I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something far more sinister was at play. The chill from that morning never left me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the voice on the other end of the call wasn't just pretending to be my boss, it was pretending to be me. Story 6. It was late, much later than I usually stayed up, but sleep was elusive. The quiet in my apartment felt oppressive, a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. I had just finished a book, the kind that lingers in your mind, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Something wasn't right. The shadows in my room seemed longer than they should be, stretching unnaturally as the darkness outside deepened. I turned over, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. The faint glow of a streetlight crept through the blinds, casting fractured beams across the dim hallway outside my bedroom. My door was ajar, just enough to make the shadows dance at the edges. I glanced at it casually, only to feel my chest tighten. From the corner of my eye, something moved. At first, I dismissed it. A trick of the light, I told myself. Shadows from a swaying tree outside. But then it happened again. A figure, darker than the shadows themselves, shifted in the hallway. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't light playing tricks. This was something real. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as my pulse thundered in my ears. The figure was tall, its form indistinct, more like a smudge of darkness carved into the faint glow. For a moment, it stood still, watching. The air in the room grew thick, as though the space between me and it were shrinking. My mind raced, scrambling for logic. Maybe it was just a trick of the eyes, a strange refraction from outside. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to convince myself to move, to reach for my phone, to call someone, anyone. But my body refused. I was paralyzed, trapped by the sheer weight of the thing's presence. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you scream. It was the kind that roots you in place, every muscle locked in primal terror. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward, its outline sharpening in the dim light. It didn't walk, it glided. Its feet never touched the ground, and the hair on my arms stood on end as I realized it wasn't bound by the same rules as me. The hallway stretched before it like a path, and it followed with an unnatural grace, drawing closer to my door with every passing second. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might drown out the sound of its movement. But there was no sound. Nothing. It was as if the thing absorbed all noise, all life. The moment it reached my doorway, it stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare blink. It stood there, a silhouette darker than the night itself, its form nearly filling the doorway. I could feel it watching me, though it had no discernible eyes. The weight of its gaze pinned me down, a predator toying with its prey. It didn't feel human, nothing about it did. It was ancient, patient, and cold. Then, with a sudden and unnerving fluidity, it shifted again. It didn't step into the room. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the doorway, blending with the darkness until it became one with it. I gasped, breaking free from the paralysis, and scrambled out of bed. My legs wobbled beneath me as I backed against the wall, my trembling hand groping for my phone on the nightstand. I needed help, but who would believe me? How could I explain this to anyone without sounding insane? I dialed a number, then stopped. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it all. But the weight in the air, the suffocating presence, it hadn't left. I could still feel it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept toward the door. The hallway was empty. Still, I hesitated, the oppressive quiet stretching around me. My every step felt like a betrayal, the creak of the floorboards threatening to draw the thing back. I peered into the darkness, searching for any trace of it. There was none. The shadows stretched long and still, and the faint hum of the streetlight returned. But I knew what I'd seen. Felt it. The kind of feeling that roots itself in your chest and never lets go. I lingered there for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any sound, any sign of movement. There was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't gone. It was still here, somewhere, watching me. Waiting. And somehow, I knew it wasn't done with me yet. Story 7. The long drive to my parents' house had left me tired but eager. This was home, the house I'd grown up in, full of warmth and familiarity. Yet, as soon as I stepped inside, a strange weight seemed to settle over me. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off as exhaustion, but a creeping unease settled deep in my stomach, refusing to be ignored. As I walked into the living room, something caught my eye. The family photos lining the walls, the same ones that had always been perfectly straight, were all tilted, just enough to feel wrong. My chest tightened as I stared at them. Reaching up to straighten one, I hesitated, a sudden chill racing down my arm. My hand hovered for a moment before I pulled it back. I tried to shake it off and headed to the kitchen, hoping to find comfort in the familiar smell of my mom's cooking. But as I passed through the hallway, the atmosphere seemed to shift again. The house felt alive, the silence too loud, pressing in on me. Even the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock sounded sharp, intrusive. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the dim light casting distorted shadows that made the space feel smaller, tighter. When I finally reached the kitchen, my mom was at the stove, stirring a pot. She turned and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze was distant, her expression forced, like she wasn't fully there. I tried to convince myself she was just distracted, but the unease gnawed at me. As I set my bag down, I noticed something else. The cabinets were all slightly ajar, their doors cracked open just enough to seem deliberate. The drawers, too, were pulled out a fraction, like someone had gone through them in a hurry. I walked around, shutting each one carefully, my heart pounding with each soft click. "Mom, have you noticed anything strange?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me, puzzled. "What do you mean?" I tried to explain, the tilted photos, the oppressive air, the cabinets, but she just smiled and said I must be tired. Her reassurance felt hollow, like she was saying it more for herself than for me. Dinner didn't help. The food tasted off. Not spoiled, but muted, like it had been stripped of its flavor. My dad sat across from me, silent and distant, barely touching his plate. His usual warmth and energy were gone, replaced by a faraway look in his eyes. After dinner, I wandered the house, trying to shake the growing sense of wrongness. Everywhere I looked, I noticed more things out of place. The rug in the living room was skewed, the chairs slightly moved, the entire house subtly rearranged in ways that felt unsettling. I made my way upstairs to my old bedroom, desperate for the comfort of familiarity. But when I opened the door, I was hit with a cold draft that didn't belong. The room looked the same at first glance, but the bed was too perfectly made, the pillows arranged differently than I'd left them. The books on my shelf were out of order, and the dresser drawers were all cracked open, just like the cabinets downstairs. My chest tightened as the realization hit me, someone, or something, had been here. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing, but the walls seemed to close in around me. The room felt foreign, like it no longer belonged to me. I stumbled back downstairs, needing to tell my parents. When I entered the living room, they were sitting in silence, staring at the TV. At first, I thought they were just engrossed in the show, but then I noticed their blank expressions. They weren't watching the screen. They weren't doing anything. "Mom? Dad?" I called, my voice shaking. They didn't respond. I stepped closer, shaking my dad's shoulder, but he didn't flinch. His eyes didn't even blink. My mom sat as still as a statue, her face void of emotion. A cold dread washed over me as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Panicked, I bolted out the front door, gasping for air. The night was dark, the air outside just as heavy as it had been inside. I turned back to look at the house. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows across the lawn. It felt alive. Watching me. I didn't know what was happening or why the house felt so wrong, but I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't home anymore. Whatever had taken root inside those walls had twisted it into something unrecognizable. I couldn't stay. Not with the suffocating weight of its presence pressing down on me. not with the feeling of being watched, hunted. I backed away, my legs trembling, and ran to my car. As I drove off into the night, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood there, silent and still, but I could swear I saw movement in one of the windows, a dark silhouette watching me leave. Whatever it was, it had taken my home. And I knew, deep down, it was never going to give it back. Story 8. I was sifting through old boxes in the attic when something caught my eye, a small, leather-bound album, buried beneath piles of forgotten trinkets and dust-covered keepsakes. I had no memory of it being there, but curiosity gnawed at me. I gently pulled it out, brushing away the years of grime, and opened the cover. Inside were faded photographs from my childhood, family gatherings, birthdays, vacations. But one photo in particular drew me in, and as my gaze landed on it, a cold shiver slithered down my spine. It was a picture of my childhood home, the house I hadn't seen in years. Yet, something was terribly wrong with it. The angle was unfamiliar, and the house seemed different. The windows were tightly shut, the garden wildly overgrown, and the paint on the walls peeled away in a way I didn't remember. But what unsettled me the most was the stark truth behind the photograph: it was taken after the house had been sold. I knew this for a fact because I had been there the day the new owners took possession. No one had set foot inside since then. How could this photo exist? I stared at it, my mind spiraling with questions. I'd never seen the house in such a state, not after it had been abandoned. It had stood empty for years after the sale, slowly deteriorating into nothing more than a shell of what it once was. But this picture, it suggested otherwise. A disturbing déjà vu gripped me, as if I had already witnessed the house in this exact condition, yet I knew that I hadn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to see it for myself. I needed answers. The drive was long, quiet, and the closer I got, the more unease settled in my stomach. When I finally turned onto the street where my old home stood, I saw it in the distance. It was still there, tall and quiet, just as I remembered. But something wasn't right. The house looked exactly like the photograph, overgrown, neglected, and shrouded in an eerie darkness. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. I parked my car, the tires crunching on the gravel, and stepped out. The front gate creaked in the wind as I walked toward it, the garden as wild and untamed as it appeared in the photo. I reached the front door, it was slightly ajar. There was no reason for it to be open. No one had lived here in years. I pushed it open cautiously, the hinges groaning with an almost mournful sound. Stepping inside, the silence was suffocating, thick with the stench of dust and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked, the air heavy, as if the house were holding its breath. Everything was exactly as I remembered, yet it wasn't. The furniture was gone, the walls bare, but there was something in the atmosphere that felt off. The house hummed with an unsettling energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest, urging me to leave, but my legs refused to listen. I moved deeper into the house, drawn to the familiar hallway leading to the bedrooms. The walls, once brightly decorated with playful wallpaper, were now peeling, their colors faded. I stopped in front of the door to my old room. It was closed, but it felt like it was calling me. I reached out and slowly opened it, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, it was exactly as I remembered, except it wasn't. The room was empty, save for a small wooden chair sitting in the center of the floor. The air here felt thicker, heavier, as though the memories of the past were pressing in on me from every side. I could almost hear the whispers of long-forgotten moments. I stepped inside, my feet sinking into the dust-covered carpet. It felt wrong, like I was intruding on something that no longer belonged to me. Something had changed in this house. Something I couldn't quite grasp. I moved toward the window and pulled back the curtains, hoping for some fresh air. Outside, everything looked as it should, my old backyard, the swing set, the tree where I'd spent so many afternoons playing. But then, my blood ran cold. There, standing at the edge of the yard, was a figure. A shadow. Too far away to make out any details, but I knew someone was there. Someone was watching me. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Panicked, I rushed out of the room and through the hallway, toward the front door. Just as my hand reached for the handle, I heard a faint creak behind me, like the floorboards were shifting. I spun around, but there was nothing. Empty space. My pulse raced, and I didn't waste another second. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop until I was in my car, hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind raced with confusion, fear, and disbelief. That house, it was always strange, always had an eerie atmosphere. But this? This was something else. How could that photograph exist, showing the house in its derelict state when no one had been inside for years? How could it look exactly like the house I had just left, down to the smallest detail? I had no answers. All I knew was that something was wrong with that house, something that defied explanation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still there. Waiting. Story 9. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world outside seems frozen in time. The air hung still, and the only sound that broke the silence was the gentle sizzle of onions and garlic in the pan. I was in the kitchen, trying my hand at a new recipe, and the warm, inviting scent filled the room, making me feel oddly content as I chopped vegetables and stirred the sauce. Outside the window, the last rays of sunlight faded, turning the sky a dusky shade of purple, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then, just as I added a pinch of salt, something shattered the calm, a firm, deliberate knock on my front door. Not the light tap of a casual visitor, but a knock that echoed in the quiet. I froze, hands suspended over the spoon, my heart suddenly uneasy. I hadn't been expecting anyone. Wiping my hands on a towel, I set the spoon down and moved toward the door, confused but still thinking it harmless. Maybe it was a neighbor, or perhaps a late delivery. I opened the door, expecting to see someone standing on the porch. But it was empty. The street stretched out before me, as still and silent as a painting, with the dim glow of streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. I scanned the surroundings, puzzled, but there was no sign of anyone. Then, something caught my eye. At the base of the door frame, on the welcome mat, was a single, dirty shoe. It looked old, its leather scuffed and worn, as though it had seen years of travel. I frowned, stepping closer to inspect it. It wasn't a shoe I recognized, nor did it seem to belong to anyone I knew. There was no reason for it to be here, abandoned on my doorstep. At first, I thought perhaps it had been dropped by mistake, some passerby unaware. But there was something unsettling about it. I bent down to pick it up, but paused, a shiver creeping up my spine. The shoe was caked in dirt, as if it had been dragged through thick mud or worn in a forgotten, unkempt place. There was no brand, no label, just a faded, worn piece of footwear that felt wrong in every way. Reluctantly, I set it back down. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I didn't know what to do with it. The thought of bringing it inside, or leaving it by the door for someone to claim, seemed absurd. The unease that had settled in my chest made me reconsider. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, my mind racing. Who would leave a shoe on my doorstep like that? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some odd, harmless coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I went back to the kitchen, but the cooking felt mechanical now, my thoughts pulled back to that shoe. The sizzle of the sauce, once comforting, now grated against my nerves, too loud, too intrusive in the thick silence. I couldn't stop thinking about the timing. The knock, so sudden, followed by the strange absence of anyone when I opened the door. It was as if someone had been waiting for me to open it. My stomach twisted. Minutes passed. The house felt suffocating, each second stretching longer than the last. I kept glancing at the door, my thoughts gnawing at me. Why had I heard the knock, only to find no one there? It felt like some twisted game I didn't understand. As the evening wore on, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. It was subtle at first, just a flicker at the edge of my awareness. But it deepened, becoming a gnawing, inescapable presence. I checked all the windows and doors, even though I knew they were locked. I moved around the house, trying to calm myself, but the unease lingered, thick and oppressive. Then, just as I was about to sit down to eat, it came again. A knock at the door. My heart stopped. It was quieter this time, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure if they should be there. I glanced at the clock, too late for a normal visitor. I debated whether or not to open the door again, but something deep inside urged me not to. I waited, breath shallow, but the knock didn't come again. I stood there, frozen for a moment, before my feet moved on their own, carrying me to the door. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I opened the door slowly, peering out. Once again, the porch was empty. No one in sight. But as I stepped outside, my breath caught. The shoe was gone. In its place was only a faint footprint in the dirt, leading away from the doorstep and fading into the shadows of the night. My mind reeled, racing through questions that had no answers. Who had knocked? Who had left the shoe? And why did I feel like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape? The night stretched on, leaving me with nothing but silence and a growing sense of dread, the answers just out of reach, lurking in the darkness. Story 10. It started innocently enough, just a strange phone call in the dead of night. I had been drifting off to sleep when the shrill ring of my landline sliced through the silence, yanking me from the brink of slumber. Groggy, I grabbed the receiver, hoping it wasn't an emergency. But on the other end, there was nothing. Just silence. I waited, listening, my pulse quickening in the quiet. And then, slow, deliberate breathing. I slammed the receiver down, dismissing it as a wrong number or some prankster's idea of fun. But then it happened again. And again. The same steady, eerie breathing, each call more unsettling than the last. I tried calling back once, but the line was dead. The calls weren't random anymore. They felt intentional, like someone, or something, was waiting for me to answer. By the fourth night, unease settled deep in my chest. I wasn't the kind of person who gets scared easily, but the repetition of those calls gnawed at me. Who was doing this? Why? I left the phone off the hook, hoping to stop the madness, but no matter what I did, the calls kept coming, silent, suffocating, deliberate. And it wasn't just at night anymore. They came during the day too, when I was eating, when I was watching TV. Sometimes I'd pick up the receiver, only to hear the same chilling breathing. The caller never spoke. The number was always unrecognizable. Whoever this was, they knew my every moment, my every move. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know who was tormenting me. I called my phone company, but they told me it was impossible to trace an unlisted or blocked number. Frustrated, I hung up, but the calls never stopped. It wasn't until the late afternoon, when I had almost lost all hope, that I decided to take a stand. This time, when the call came, I didn't hesitate. As soon as I heard the familiar breathing, I pressed *69, hoping to trace the call. My heart pounded as the number appeared on the screen, unfamiliar, random. But then, an address flashed across my phone. A payphone, just a few blocks away. A payphone? No, that couldn't be right. There were no payphones in my neighborhood, not anymore. The closest one, according to the trace, was hidden in an alley behind a small convenience store. I didn't waste a second. Curiosity gnawed at me like a festering wound, and I rushed out of my house, my nerves buzzing. The walk was short, just 10 minutes, but as I neared the alley, a cold shiver crawled down my spine. The usual hum of city life was replaced by a stifling silence. I passed a darkened storefront, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. Finally, I reached the payphone. It stood there, old and weathered, the glass cracked, the receiver hanging loosely. I approached cautiously, scanning the shadows for any sign of life. But the alley was empty. I peered inside the booth, half expecting someone to be waiting, but it was deserted. My heart sank. There was no way someone could have made those calls from this phone without leaving a trace. And yet, there it was, the booth, untouched, as if it had been waiting for me. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat, when something caught my eye. A crumpled piece of paper, partially hidden in the shadows near the phone. My hands trembled as I picked it up, unfolding it with shaking fingers. At first, the paper was blank. But when I turned it over, the words were scrawled in dark ink, "You're closer than you think." My stomach twisted into a knot. I stood there, the words reverberating in my mind. Whoever had been calling me, they knew where I was. They had been watching, waiting, and now I was in their sights. I looked around, but the alley remained eerily silent. No one was there. I couldn't stand it any longer. I ran back home, my heart hammering in my chest, my thoughts a whirl of confusion and dread. Who had left that note? Why had they been calling? What did they mean by, "closer than you think"? When I reached my house, I locked the door behind me, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The calls, the note, the suffocating sense that I was being watched, it was too much. I sat in the dark, my phone beside me, knowing the call was coming. I didn't know what to expect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. And when morning came, I checked my phone, praying for some semblance of peace. But there were no missed calls, no voicemails. And yet, I knew. The caller was still out there, somewhere, waiting. Watching.